I know you said you may not be the top purchaser, but somewhere near the top. And this was because of the Logs to Food project that I've been working on and trying to get started in the Atlanta area. He said that, you know, Patrick had been working with procuring a lot of logs and inoculating a lot of logs, like in a super easy way. And we actually had a chance to go visit his operation earlier this year. And it was interesting. We were going to see the Jadam organic method of growing plants. And then we just happened to also be seeing Patrick's method of growing mushrooms, both of which are easier than most other methodologies that are out there. And so it was a really fun weekend to get to see both of those things. And one of Patrick's credentials that I just love is he was working with Dr. San Antonio when shiitake first was allowed to come into the United States. They were concerned about, you may be talking about this some more, so maybe I won't talk about that. But anyway, he was one of the original people that got to work with shiitake cultivation in the United States. And then also traveled to Japan and meet people. And then they also did a lot of experimentation, which you're going to hear about. And I like that. I think, you know, Patrick was kind of ready to head into retirement or something, but here he is busier than ever with this booming business that he's got going with, oh, great. So, sorry, I got distracted by Lily Clark has joined us. It's really great.
Oh,
so,
really?
Yeah. So I think she must be on our mailing list. So Lily was a previous speaker. So anyway, I know we had a list of credentials in there and all the places you've studied and the things you've done, but I'm just really impressed with what you've figured out and what you're going to share with us. And I know there'll be tons of questions, and I just want to give you the floor, basically, Patrick. So,
cool.
So now you'll want to share your screen again.
Okay, let's see if I can. Did that work?
That's great.
Okay. I guess I should probably start off with that both Joe and I from Field and Forest, Joe's from Forestville, and him and I talked back and forth. And one of the first things that we'll admit is that although we've been doing this a long time, we don't consider ourselves experts on it. We probably have more knowledge than most people do. But one thing we both agree on is that the people that say that they're the expert mushroom growers, we find it really hard to believe because there's so much to learn. And at this point, in time, we're just really, the information is just coming in at incredible speeds. Anyway, so that's where we start. I started with Dr. San Antonio over 40 years ago. And so that's, I probably got the luckiest job in the world in college, working with him. Anyway, the first slide here is about the origins of mushroom cultivation. Wild foraging is the most common thread between Europe and Asia. The next thing is that there's pretty good evidence that even before we have writings and everything else, that native species were being propagated by spores, mycelial clumps, and substrates with varying levels of success. Especially the mycelial clumps was very used throughout France and this and that, and they would go to where garrix would be coming up, and they would dig up that mycelial mats and then move it to wherever they wanted to do it. And just like the spreading of plant cultivars, vegetative cuttings, and seed trading, there's documentation that mushroom culture trading, in the sense of spores and clumps and inoculated substrates, has also been going on for a long time. One of the good things about giving tours through the farm in Maryland here, we probably had about maybe 5,000 people come through. What our objective is to get them involved in growing mushrooms. But the best one had to do with this woman from the Philippines. She was had to be in her 90s, and she sat down. She was telling me how that when she was little, that her grandmother, all the mothers would bring the kids over to grandmother's house, and then she would send the kids out into the woods for sticks of woods ear growing on them. And then when they would bring them back, they would take and pile them into big piles, and with the purpose of that, all she'd have to do is go out her backyard a little bit, and she'd be picking woods ear. It's really the cultivation at its best, and it's been going on for centuries. The next thing has to do with one thing that became pretty obvious with Dr. San Antonio and I, and with conversations, especially with Romanians and this and that, that due to continuous wars through Europe, made food really scarce, and especially anything that had protein. So basically what would happen is as the soldiers would come through, they would kill anything with, chickens, beef, cattle, pigs, everything. And real quickly, they learned that they could take the mushrooms, dry them, and the soldiers and everything typically weren't interested in that. So it was a source of protein during these rough times. At the fall of the Iron Curtain, we had Russian scientists that came over that visited the lab. And in one of the conversations with him, the guy told us that his job was to supply the Viet Cong with ampules of Wolveriella spawn, which was used by the Viet Cong as a protein source, because just like in Europe, anything, all the animals were basically killed, and the only source of proteins were in encampments. And it actually fit into another story about Wolveriella, which we'll go through a little later. But probably the first and most interesting one is the pit culture. And basically, I had access to the USDA Agricultural Library in Beltsville, Maryland. So working with an SY and that, I was allowed to go up into the stacks. And it's one of the largest collection of agricultural journals and things like that. And we quickly came upon these pit cultivation methods that were being used by mainly Hungary, Poland, Romania, a few other countries in there. And basically what they were doing is they were digging pits using dried oyster mushrooms in between the log sections, and that and they would typically do this in the fall, and it would be a village event because some of these pits would be 20 by 40, 60 feet wide, 10, 15 feet deep. They later, as time went on and spawn became available, they replaced the dried mushrooms with fresh spawn. This is a terrible drawing, but this is, so you would start with a pit, and then they would cut the trees down and restack those trees with the spawn in between them. So they would fill up these pits to the top, and then what they would do is they would cover it with straw and allow it to incubate over the winter. Then as the winter started to break, they would unearth the pits, and what they typically found were the solid mycelial blocks. And the logs would be inoculated all the way through. And then they would use mallets to break them apart in different sections. And then if you were part of the people that helped do this, you would be given your share of the logs. And typically what they would do is plant them in shady areas. And after the first rains and the weather gets warmer, they would start fruiting. And classically, they would fruit initially the first time when they came out of the pits. Then they would fruit usually a little later on spring, and then a fall fruiting. And in the case of the oyster mushrooms, logs, they would typically be eaten up within 2 to 3 years. But the yield on this is just crazy. And what they would do is they would eat what they could fresh, and the rest they would dry and pickle. And they had a couple other methodologies that they would use. They would make gravies, stuff like that. So if we go to France, what you're going to see is that's really where the what we call the regular button mushroom started. And originally, when it was being cultivated, they were collecting spores, usually from spore prints and that. Or if you look to the right, you'll see the mycelial mats. And it was very common for them to dig those up. And then initially, the initial records show them basically growing them in piles of sawdust, wood, whatever was available. And it was a trial and error method. And typically the yields were fairly low, but it was better than nothing. So out of that came pit structures and cave structures. What you see on the right are the more modern mushroom houses, but the original older mushroom caves and everything would literally they would just take the spawn that they grabbed up above, mix it with manure, and then and then shape it, and then see what would come out of it. I didn't have the first thing on this. When you start to look at Asian culture, the early culture talks about what they would do is drag the logs to a central location. And in the process of doing that, they would hope that some of them would be inoculated. The other thing was that they would take dried fruit and rub it on the bark of the logs. Many times they would also make cuts and slits and things like that. And classically, what would happen is after they had done that, they would hire a priest to bless the inoculation. And if the logs didn't fruit, then what they would obviously say was that they didn't pay the priest enough, and that's why they didn't fruit. Then the other thing that, like I said earlier, was the cutting and the damaging of the bark, rubbing it into the wounds. The other method that they had was that they would take the log, an inoculated log, and then place an uninoculated log next to it. And classically, they would put those in the ground and sometimes throw mulch or whatever on top. Then all of a sudden, they started using a pick method. And what they had a hammer that they would take and slap it into the log, poking a hole, and then they would take pieces of a fruiting log and stuff it in there. And that definitely increased the yield, but nothing significant. Then around 1910, 1920, you're starting to see the pure cultures of vegetated propagated mushrooms appearing. This one here, I believe, is agaricus, the regular champignon, but shiitake was basically done around this same time. And that's where this guy Mori comes along. I met Dr. Mori in I guess it was in the early 70s. And what he had done, he was a graduate student in Japan, and he was the one that figured out that he took wooden dowels, sterilized them, and then inoculated them with pure cultures of shiitake. And that was used to inoculate logs, commonly called the Dow method. And that method there increased the successful collination very close to 100%. It made him an unbelievably rich man, and it also revolutionized the shiitake industry and actually the whole mushroom industry in Asia. When I met him, he had a hotel in Hong Kong Harbor, and he also started what's called the Mori Institute. The Mori Institute, their primary thing was that they were taking all of as many cultures as they could, collecting like inotaki, shiitake, as many oysters as they could. He was also starting a breeding program, in which in Japan, what it really turned into was it created a market. It stimulated growers, and then the market, because of its high protein value, and when you compare it to the price of meat, it's a fairly good, it's actually cheaper there for the mushrooms. So what really happened after that was there was an incredible explosion in the mushroom industry. And because of the seasonal nature of the shiitake log fruit, spring and fall, the intensive sawdust block culture started. And this opened the door to even more expansion of the market, trying to fill the market demand. The one you see on the right there, the left is chestnut. Then of course you have oyster. And then if you, all the way to the right, there are literally rooms full of this that they incubate. And then they bring them out into a fruiting room. And that's the classic way it's done. I'm gonna skip this and because it's covered in the next thing. The US market came a little later than both the European market and the Asian market. And really it was based on the button mushroom. It had a very small niche, and that was primarily due to the price of it and the availability. It was brought in by, and the knowledge to how to grow it, and that was brought in by the Italians and French immigrants. And the only way that you could learn it was on-the-job training. And it was very family oriented. Example being that, you would teach your sons, and then, it would pass along generation to generation. And over time, it really ended up being that there were maybe 10 or 15 families that really controlled most of the mushroom production in the United States. About this same time, pure cultivated culture, spawn, was being produced now. And what it did was it increased yield and reduced contamination. The problem was that most of the spawn being produced was made in France and was shipped here. So it was expensive and would be considered nowadays to be of poor quality. Because if you think about how long it would take to get across the US and across the ocean, and the ordering of it, things like this. And it turned out that at that time, and even today, the spawn is one of the major costs in the mushroom production. Spawn from really, even in France now, they were always grown in glass jars, which was very difficult to handle and expensive to ship. It also limited the distance from which a facility could be located from your spawn producer. So most of the mushroom companies started around the Kennett Square area. This is a classic jar here of spawn, and it would take, even currently today, it's about a minimum of a month and a half, if not 3 months, to make a jar of spawn. Along with the increase in production came the canning industry. So basically anything that couldn't be sold relatively quick, a canning industry started up in the Kennett Square area. It was later wiped out by imported canned mushrooms, leaving only the fresh market for revenue. And about sort of rolling right into the next end of that was right after the Chinese, mind the expression, probably knocked out 20 to 30% of the mushroom growers. The Penn State and USDA opened up mushroom research facilities. And this was basically right after World War II. These facilities were really credited with increasing synthetic compost, new methods for insect control, new culture techniques, and new mushroom strains. This is a picture of Dr. San Antonio. He was the first USDA mushroom guy. Compared to Japan or anything like with the Mori Institute, which probably housed 20 to 50, or I should say, hired 20 to 50 PhDs, Dr. San Antonio was really the only one that was hired by USDA to get it started. And then he worked cooperatively with pathologists, mycologists, and various other people, marketing and everything else. This was the lab. The first thing you're going to notice is Dr. San Antonio looks a little unusual. He actually was an extremely nice person, very intelligent. He went to work at USDA for the group in 1953. He received his bachelor's and doctorate from University of Chicago. After he had been in World War II, he had been a tank destroyer unit. He did his first postdoc with Dr. Carl Raper at Harvard. And what Carl Raper was known for is that he was the first one to identify hormones. He isolated them and then their role in sexual reproduction. And there's actually a whole story that you could just tell on his stuff. The USDA mushroom group, their primary mission was to support the button mushroom industry. But their other missions included small farms, supporting mushroom cultivation in different countries, the DEA, but primarily it was supposed to be the interests of the public good. When you look at Dr. San Antonio's background, he was a trained geneticist and a physiologist. And since not a lot was known about the mushroom industry, he was on a catch-up from day one. This is the USDA facility in Beltsville. And if you look into the right corner in the front building, that's where the mushroom lab was at. And it was probably no more than 2,000 square feet at best, packed full with microscopes, all types of culture equipment, things like that. The mushroom group was as it was called, was a small subset of the USDA ARS vegetable division. So compared to other crops like wheat, even tomatoes and things like this was the smallest group. And although there was fairly good financial support, it was pretty tight. But anyway, San Antonio's big claim to fame was he introduced the practice of storing mushroom strains in liquid nitrogen, which was one of the biggest problems because they're so easy to contaminate. He also worked on strain improvement techniques, worked with the industry and culture cultivation techniques, increasing yield and reducing pesticide usage. He worked on compost supplementation, increasing yield, and also the improved pasteurization techniques. And along with everything else, he was working with all the other mushrooms as they were coming out. And the first one had to do with shiitake. Originally, shiitake was on a quarantine list because they considered it to be a pathogen, which he basically had to file all the paperwork to allow it to be, for cultures to be legally to enter the United States. Although by this time, we already had numerous people had smuggled these strains in, and cultivation and the shiitake thing was just getting started. Part of his mission was to support the introduction of mushroom cultivars and the cultivation techniques to the U.S. public. So he developed things like little kits to show people how mushrooms were grown, and basically things like how to make little steam generators. And he had a little kit that was in the styrofoam container that you can make so that you could grow the regular agaricus. And probably the most important thing with him was he really worked from the minute I got to work with him. He always told me that he worked for the U.S. public. This later on caused a lot of problem with him and the administration at USDA. We worked on the agaritin project, which, if you don't know what agaritin is, it's one of the major carcinogens and is found in the button mushroom. And I worked on a project with him where we checked all the different strains of the Agaricus bisporus and this and that, and it was in every one of them. And one of our objectives, if it had continued, would be to try to breed that out or to breed it to lower amounts. But the mushroom industry, the button mushroom industry, caught wind of it, and they thought that it would destroy the industry because they were selling almost all of their fruit fresh. And ironically, a lot of people eat fresh mushrooms. The next thing that we worked on, it was called the spawn disc method for inoculating logs to produce mushrooms. And this is basically it's the totem method that had been used throughout Europe. And when we were working on it, the first issue that we always had was that when you did the totem method, you would put the spawn in between the different sections. It would be very exposed to contamination. And also, once you built that totem, you couldn't move it. So it really limited how much you could do. So we were trying to figure out a way to do it. And we knew that if you took the spawn and crumbled it, and it would reestablish itself usually within 1 to 2 weeks, and it would look like a pancake. We then knew that we could slap it on the ends of the logs. And in this case here, we used foil. And what would happen, it would inoculate the ends of the logs and would travel through the entire log at a lot faster rates than what we ever thought. We did sectioning to see how fast it moved through. And it was not unusual to get 3 to 6 inches in a month's time. I guess that goes through the stacking. The other thing about allowing the discs or the spawn to recolonize is that there's less free sugar available for other organisms to grow. Contamination by trichoderma, penicillin, aspergillus, and this and that, they're always looking for free sugar. And of course, they're in the air all the time. We did recommend that you use heavy duty foil, and it allows the disc to be more protective. Neither Dr. San Antonio or myself ever felt that there were not better alternatives to the use of foil. We just didn't find any at that time. By the time this article was published, this was published in Hort Science, we had tested a bunch of other species and had incredibly good luck with shiitake. We did the shiitake on cured logs, and we did it on fresh cut logs. And we had amazingly good success at both, although the final yield studies on the shiitake and the rate of successful inoculation was published in a journal called, can't remember the name. If you hunt his name, you'll be able to find it. But we are close to 100% inoculation rates. We also tested this on tree stumps. So we were basically hitting just about every type of tree, from cherry to gum, the poplar, you name it. And so what we would do is we would make the spawn disc, set it on top of the tree stump, and then typically we would wrap a tape or something like that to keep the aluminum foil on. The biggest problem that we found was that other animals were attracted, especially squirrels. They'd like to sit there because of the reflecting from the sun, and they would tear holes in the foil. But we still got an amazingly high rate of inoculation. Again, we did a lot of different trees, and it's basically, the premise is based on that the hardwood of deciduous trees, they're dead cells. So they don't make wound responses very fast, and it just colonizes easier. And we typically found that the fresher the cut, the better the colonization. People always ask about the size of the log. From commercially, I look at it like safety should dictate this. When you start using large logs, let's say 2 foot diameter, 3 foot diameter, this becomes really critical. I broke my leg on a 5 foot, 3.5 foot diameter log. The other thing that you have to worry about is removing the foil. If you leave the foil on, and what typically happens with us is I might do 400 or 500 logs in a single day, and I might not get back to those maybe 3 months, 6 months, 9 months to remove the foil. If you don't remove the foil, it ends up blowing off, and then you end up with a mess, and then usually your spouse gives you a really hard time about that. But the foil is recyclable. This is the actual article in Hort Science. It was 3 pages. We initially, when it was published, we had 1,000 copies printed for us, and those 1,000 copies were gone within a year. I will tell you that when you read it, it's a good lesson on how to read for comprehension, because every word, every sentence was rewritten and written at least 4 or 5 times. It took us over 3 months to write the article, and it was reviewed prior to publication by at least 20 different organizations and people. It is really a packed full article.
So
this
Patrick,
is a good
just so you
example
know,
here. These logs were inoculated basically in 1 day by myself. I had the logs delivered, these were delivered logs, and I'd have them stacked up, and this was no problem at all. I had lunch and I had dinner, and I was done before dark. And this is classical. I would recommend one other thing that's not shown on here, and it's not mentioned in the article, is that when you make a stack like this, which would be, it would be like a bedding, that you cover that. Not because of insects, but because of wind blowing the foil off. You'd be surprised how little contamination you get. And we found that generally the fall inoculation, when the leaves are off the trees and everything, was the safest. And we got really good inoculation rates. We didn't have to worry about watering or anything like that because those ends were closed. And the whole thing on the stacking here was to actually stack it so that you could go through the inoculation procedure as fast as possible. A little closer look at the foil and how they went on and stuff like that. We also use a lot of logs here in Maryland. We used a lot of logs that were split and cracked and things like this, and still had pretty good success. This is what a typical colonized log will look like after you pull the foil off. And you'll see that the mycelium is, you know, what, 6-8 inches up the side. And that end of that log is completely inoculated. And it's running through. This was most likely Pleurotus cornucopia. After a while, you can tell the differences between them. We don't bother scraping off the remaining mycelium or anything like that. And this is on poplar. Yeah, that's poplar. Which is well, that's another thing. Here's your cornucopia. And you also find that after these are inoculated, a lot of times and you'll see this later, on the different ways to lay them out. This was laid in a wood chip mulch, and out from the logs would grow the mushrooms, and the mycelium would be all through there. In the case of the cornucopia, we had a bed that would continue to fruit for 4 or 5 years, even after the logs were pretty much eaten. It was basically eating all the mulch. This was the other big article, and this was, we used basidiospores of the oyster mushroom to prepare grain spawn, and actually should have been sawdust grain spawn for mushroom cultivation. I'm going to skip to the next slide. Oh, no, I guess I can't. One of the problems that San Antonio had with the whole thing was that the mushroom industry was centralized in Kennett Square. And to expand the mushroom market, we knew that it had to be decentralized. And that it also had to have access to inoculum. And as it turns out, we had contacted a lot of the big button mushroom companies, and they really weren't interested because they were still trying to produce as much button as they can. And then to make it worse, the spawn producers, which were the ones that were, could really expand it throughout the country, they weren't interested in the so-called exotics due to what they felt was a limited demand and a small profit margin. And they were also afraid about contaminating their other stocks. So the opening of small mushroom cultivation and part-time and for home gardeners would only be limited by the availability of mushroom spawn and cultures. So, and considering that it's the most expensive part of the mushroom cultivation besides labor, we decided that we would look at how people could make their own spawn. As it turns out, the oyster mushroom spores can germinate at a rate of about 90% in 2 days on agar and on various substrates. And it's just crazy how fast they are. It's one of the fastest, although there are some that are faster. The Schizophyllum, it's literally minutes before they'll germinate. And this became a crucial thing because when you, it's one thing to work in a sterile environment, but if you don't have a sterile environment, your success rate in making spawn goes down. So we later did this on other mushroom species also, and we had some luck, but we concentrated on the oyster. The idea of using a spore suspension to inoculate substrates directly was considered, but we failed at warranting testing at that time because there was only 2 of us. We did put snail gut enzyme pre-treatment on Agaricus brunescens, our Bisporus, and that showed very promising results. And that was right before I was transferred out of the mushroom division. So anyway, just to go a little bit more in depth with this, was that what you would do is you would collect a spore print on wax paper. You would then cut the little squares of that mushroom spore print that you had, and you would put it in Ziploc bags. You would then take it out of the Ziploc, then you would, using a pressure cooker, you would cook your grain, a grain mix, which is described in the paper. It also is published in Hort Science. You would then take a sterile vial of water, and you would, with a forceps, you would drop one of those little pieces of the wax paper containing the spores in it, and you would shake it up. And we knew that the concentration of spores was important, both on the side that if you had too many, it would inhibit the growth of the spores. Too few, it wouldn't colonize very fast. We then sucked a sample of that up in a syringe and injected it into a sterilized jar that we had done in an autoclave with the sawdust grain mix. Within 4 days, you'd actually see the colonies growing. You would then shake it up, and within a week, the entire jar would be white, pretty much solid. You could then take it out of there and use it to make spawn discs, and which is basically you take a piece of foil, you take the spawn and you spread it out over the foil roughly around the size of the logs that you're going to inoculate. You put a piece of foil on top, crimp the edges. You wait about a week, you'll look inside and it'll be a white pancake. And then you slap it on the ends of the log and then just crimp the edges. We did find a difference between using what we would call pure spawn and the spawn that was from the spore suspension. And we were there was two factors of that. One was that the spores of the Pleurotus are one end, and they need to mate, which slows down the process. So when you inject it in, they go through a mating process. And then, so the period of time takes a little longer. And there's also a contamination issue of various bacteria in there. So we felt that the spawn discs weren't as good as the ones that came from the, I guess you'd call sterile, I should say, pure spawn. But it still worked fine. So anyway, the article tells it, and you're welcome to ask questions on it. We really believe that there were a lot of other mushrooms that could be used with it, but again, it's only so many hours in a day. The other one that we worked on was the straw mushroom. It's probably the third or fourth most sold mushroom in the world. It's grown in the tropics, classically on rice straw, and fast cropping, 10 to 18 days. And the other thing is it's a hot weather. It grows at about 95 to 115 degrees, and it colonizes at a rate that is just unbelievable. Classically, that's what it looks like when you see it, sitting on spawn. Typically, when it's sold in its button stage. It is an excellent mushroom, both in flavor and texture. And the other thing about it is the aroma. The first time I grew it in Hyattsville, Maryland, I walked in with a basket of it to a Chinese restaurant, and the owner, who was in the back in the kitchen, came right out and knew exactly what it was. And then, I made a deal with him for meals for about a month and a half in the trade. Most of it is sold in the U.S. in cans, mainly because we don't have any growers here. It's considered an ethnic food, although the demand for it is off the chart. Later on, commercially, we've done it in large beds. We only got it to a farmer's market one day, and then after that, every day we would have a group of people that would come and pick everything. They'd buy everything that we had. It was a sort of a ridiculous game. Here it is in the straw. We had chopped the straw. This straw here was non-supplemented, but you can see, you know, it grows pretty fast. If you're growing it correctly with enough temperature and minimal temperature fluctuations, it grows at a rate like I've never seen anything that fast. And what you do is you inoculate it, and when the temperature is right and everything, overnight it will turn into what I would call a hairy turd. And then you knock it down with cold water, similar to the procedures that you use for Garvis. And then by the next morning, you'll start to see pins forming. And by the afternoon, you'll have fruit, or the egg state. If you wait till the next morning, those eggs will be open and it loses its marketability. Although there are a lot of people, there are people that buy it fully open. We tried spawn from a bunch of different companies, and Mushroom Mountain gave us the best results. And they only have it available a short period of time, and they're willing to work with us to develop it further. They want to grow it on a media that is rich in grain, but it grows best and the yields best in a mixture of very little nutrient. And in fact, the preferred medium throughout the world is perlite and wheat bran. And you're probably talking for a 5-pound bag. It's basically straight perlite, a teaspoon of wheat bran, you autoclave it, you inoculate it. Within 14 days, it's done, ready to go. And then when you take it, you crumble it up, put it in there, and it just grows like a beast. It doesn't like the cold weather. One of the other things about the mushroom, well, here it is. Here's our, you know, they're actually fruiting here. We did these in boxes, cardboard boxes, and we did different supplementations. We used wheat bran, we used various composts, all types of different things. We also did lime pasteurization. We did submerged water pasteurization, all types of different ways. Most of all of them worked. Where we started to have problems with it not working when it came to supplementation, that as we increased the supplementation, our yield would go down. We were planning the next round, if we had been here, would have been to do 150, 200 feet rows of it and fruit it out that way to increase the amount that we can sell. We don't believe that we'll ever hit the maximum peak for the market demand for it. We would probably be the only commercial people growing it. Slugs do love it, you know, so one of the things that you'd have to do is put a lime solution around your beds. San Antonio grew it in Beltsville in an environmentally controlled room using modern cultivation techniques, and he recorded the yield, and that's published. He got about 4 to 5 times what the yield is for most people growing it, you know, without out in outdoor culture. But one of the main things that we came up was that it was the fluctuation of the temperature that made a really big difference. If you have a cold night, it sets it back. I've grown it twice in Maryland with success. One was on a porch in Hyattsville, Maryland, right next to the University of Maryland, which goes to show that my wife has a lot of indulgence in her, because, I mean, I did this on our back porch, and you know, it's not a clean thing. The other thing is the availability of the inoculum. right now, Field and Forest is working on it. They have about 4 or 5 different cultures. The Magic Mountain, there are a couple other companies that sell it in the form of, if you try to get it in a liquid form, good luck. The ones that I got from that never even left the straw. The other thing about it is that when we go back to earlier, and I was saying how the Russians were supplying the Viet Cong with spawn for it, out in Beltsville, when we were growing it, it grows so fast across an auger plate that, in the sense of a large auger plate, within 5 to 6 days, it would be on the edge of the plate, which is generally bad news for culturing because you can never tell when it gets contaminated. It also grows so fast that it uses up most of the water in the plate. And it was at this time that we started seeing it forms what are called sclerotia. And what those look like are little pieces of grape nut flakes, if you've ever eaten grape nuts, little knobby and everything like that. And we really didn't do anything with that, didn't look at that until later on when we were actually growing psilocybin in a growth chamber. And what happened was it was at the end of the experiment, and we had a bunch of Wolveriella petri dishes that we wanted to cook out. So we stuck them in the incubator, and it was on a Friday, and I cranked the temperature up to max, thinking that would basically, kill everything in there. It gets up to about 110, 120 degrees. And we had that run overnight, and then it turned off. When we came back on Monday, the entire Forma box was filled with a white mycelium that turned up was Wolveriella. And so what we found was that those sclerotia, when you give them moisture and heat, they'll germinate, and they grow with such they grow so fast, it's just unbelievable. Which goes back to the Russians. When they originally told us that they were providing ampules to the Viet Cong, we were very skeptical because it grows so fast that in a little ampule, you might get a week or 2 weeks max before they would be all dried up. So what we think was happening was that the auger inoculum, they were actually producing the chlamydospores, which is an overwintering structure. So the Viet Cong would open it up, throw it in, those sclerotia would germinate. We did germinate a few of them to see how well it worked, and it works very good. And I think that eventually what will probably happen is that you'll have spawn producers that will produce the sclerotia to sell as inoculum to homeowners and commercial. I've already talked to Joe about this, and he's actually done a couple preliminary, but it's like on the pile of things to do. But that way, what we could do is we could inoculate a whole bed fairly quickly with a high density inoculation rate, and even increase the fruiting period faster. The other one that we're really interested in is woodsier. It's somewhere in the top 5 mushrooms grown in the world. It has a tremendous amount of medicinal studies on it. And we also have species of it that will grow on pine. Currently right now, we can use almost any species of wood that's deciduous. And if we can crack open into the pine species, that's even a bigger market. It grows successfully on sawdust blocks, and we've inoculated hardwood logs, currently, so they seem to be growing fine. Forest and Field is also working on growing various strains. They've got at least 4 or 5. It's primarily sold dried, And I've only seen it for sale twice in the United States, where it was, cultured ones. And one of those was from China. Here it is. This is one species growing off of a log. They're ridiculously easy. Here it is dried. And that dried market is a tremendously large market. Everybody here is, if you've eaten sweet and sour soup, you've had it. And the public is not afraid of it at all. The flavor is actually a lot better fresh. And they say that the medicinal values are even better. Matter of fact, NIH wants to do a study on utilizing fresh woods ear, but they have a problem finding a source of the fruit because they want to know, one, what type of wood it was grown on and what the species was, what the strain, and then they want to be able to repeat it. So we've actually been in contact with them about this, and we're years away from getting that together, but they're interested in us supplying them with especially 2 different strains. And then they'll do the carcinogenic testing and a whole bunch of other testing with it. And that looks very promising. This is another, I don't go too far into this, but what we did, we inoculated with the spawn disc method and the plug method, and we buried them in sawdust and wood chip. And mainly what we did that for was, one, to keep the temperature down and also to keep the moisture up and the amount of moisture that was lost. After 2 months, we checked the inoculated logs for growth. We grew 5 different species of oyster, 5 different shiitake. Almost all of them showed signs of complete inoculation. And you could actually see mycelium growing out of the logs into the sawdust and wood chips. Here's an inoculated log. As a matter of fact, this is beech. And this is the classic, you see the white zones. That's where this was a plug inoculated. And it's one of the characteristics we use to see if a log has been inoculated. High tunnel production. This is a new area. It all started with, we went from the buried, and we wanted to, because a lot of people they always ask us about, oh, well, if it's warmer, will it colonize the log faster, and this and that. So what we did, we had a high tunnel, and we basically we did the spawn disc method, we did the plug method of oyster, mainly of oyster mushroom, and then we took inoculated logs of shiitake, and we put them in the greenhouse, covered them with a layer of sawdust and or wood chip. Then we put another layer on top, same story, about 6 to 8 deep. So they'd be about 4.5 feet. And then within 3 months, so then what happened is we get a phone call from, the reason we were doing this initially was so that we could have a large crop of oyster mushrooms for the spring markets. But we got a call from a farmer's market asking if we could produce fruit during the winter time. So we went in and gave it a shot, and it was about 3 months from when we started, and we unburied them, the top layer, and started irrigating with sprinklers. Within 2 weeks, the oyster mushrooms were fruiting. And then after the top layers would fruit, we would then unbury the next layer, and then they would fruit. So we went through the entire winter in an unheated, open-ended high tunnel. We actually had to open up the ends because they were fruiting too fast. And we found the same results with the shiitake that we would get, but they really had to be a little older. We had some that fruited as early as 6 months, but the 18 months were now fruiting almost immediately. Here's a picture of the log standing up. And you can see the quality of the fruit coming off here was just incredible. Plus, being in the wintertime, no insect problems, which is one of the major things that we have with them. And when we start doing all the calculations out, it turns out there's probably no crop that you can grow in a greenhouse, with the exception of probably marijuana, that would yield the same dollar value. It's crazy, and very profitable. Plus, it now extends our market. In fact, we found that our fall markets and winter markets were so strong we couldn't even keep up with it. Here's some other ones you can see, and you can also see the sawdust where it's actually grown into them. We have sawdust blocks also between those logs that they're the ready to fruit blocks and things like this that we would use again to supplement. We just couldn't grow enough. Here's where you can see the mycelium is actually growing in the sawdust, and this is a mixed sawdust that had pine, you name it, in it. So there was no limit to that. So now we're moving into log stacking. Everybody here has probably seen the classic teepee, where they make lines of them. And I give Japanese women a kudo, because I tried doing that and I spent more time restacking them that it became extremely frustrating. So then we went to it's called a flatbed method, which basically you take and make a sawdust or wood chip base, and then you just lay the logs on top. And that works pretty good, although you still get a lot of slug and snail contamination. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that you get a lot of growth into the sawdust, and the yields on this knock your socks off. And of course, you're putting a lot of logs per square feet, which means picking is easier. I would not recommend putting them in such large, wide rows, because you need to walk in there to pick. We also found that if you threw a shade cloth on top of that, that would increase the fruiting too, so that you could get fruiting and extend the fruiting or start it earlier. We used the black regular shade cloth, although later on we were using white frost protection cloth, which is really cheap. This is the Cornell method. The first thing I have to say about it is that Cornell likes to steal everybody's ideas and names and like to give it their name to it. This is really good for steep slopes. It's actually a takeoff of another Japanese method, but basically at the bottom of your hill or slope, you put one log horizontally, and then you run a bunch of logs vertically, and then you put another log on the ends of those logs, and you keep doing that right up the hill. So you can go up a 45-degree slope with no problem, and it stays very stable. And it keeps the majority of the log off the ground. And of course, you're going to have high humidity being close to the ground. The other thing, which when we had the soil conservation people come out, was that this really slows. We had this in a gully. Camilla can tell you that it was a pretty steep area, and it helps with erosion because you have those basically horizontal logs. It works pretty good. We eventually went to what's called the tripod or the triangle, and so you have one log that is in full contact with the ground, and then you basically make your triangle all the way up to whatever height that you want to go. You want to be careful with the height because it becomes a danger for people, which you'll see a little slide about that a little later. The other big advantage of this is that we do get some deer damage, but the deer will only go to the outside of the circle, and they will knock most of them off, not even eating them. But here you can actually reach down in between, and you can pick, and gives you a higher quality fruit. Obviously a nice fruiting here. Major pests, slugs. Slugs do most of our damage, especially with shiitake. And what we found is using the application of hydrated lime around the logs. You can also use various slug deterrents. There's some other things too. There's one called a funny beetle. It's a Trilex. It really knocks the oyster mushrooms back. And a scarab, which is like a little mosquito thing, slime molds, and then other fungi. Here is your the wasp damage. You can see the end. This is a king oyster mushroom, and it'll lay eggs, and then those eggs will turn into larvae and go right up the stem. And you can also see some damage to the top of the fruit there, where that's the actual beetle damage. In the sense of contamination, here we've got shiitake growing with puffballs coming off the log. And this log was probably 10 to 15 years old, still fruiting. But even though we have the other contamination, the shiitake still is coming through it with no problem. Here's the other guy. And this is mainly for your heart attack. Especially with when we were growing Volva variella, the snakes really like the straw. So you always got to check before you reach in there and get a surprise. This is probably a regular gardener snake, not a big deal. But in this area here, we do have copperheads. And to be honest with you, I've never found a copperhead in our growing area. I find a lot of big king snakes and black snakes, but nothing poisonous. Wood substrates. Deciduous trees are our primary substrate. Fresh cut trees are our preference. And we'll literally inoculate the day that it's cut. The denser the wood, the higher the yield. When you take tables like you see in Field and Forest on their website, and they'll have different ones checked off and this and that. And that's kind of important for commercial production, but for homeowners and smaller growers, this is not an issue, whether or not you get 4, 5, 6 pounds versus 2 or 3 or 4. It's really what you have available. So there are a lot of people that grow just on maple. There are some people that grow just on oaks. We grow it on everything. And as a matter of fact, even black walnut, we've actually had it produce fruit off it. I wish I could tell you whether or not the yield was good, but we generally didn't stop around and do a study for that. We also prefer to cut and inoculate in the fall. And that's mainly because the trees weigh dramatically less with the leaves off. That's a lot safer. And when we inoculate in the fall, there's never an issue as to whether or not we have enough moisture in the log and whether or not it needs to be watered. I'm lazy. We don't water except for, when we have to force things. There's also a lot less insects, which makes the inoculation a little better. Spawn suppliers, just like in the seed business, your quality of your spawn is everything. We do a lot of business with Field and Forest out of Wisconsin. I've been there. I've looked at their operations. They've made incredible investments there. I also stay away from liquid cultures, auger slants, and straight grain spawn. Actually, I could probably skip this page because I want to go. Oh, here's Field and Forest, Wisconsin in the winter. There's your liquid spawns. One of the problems we found with liquid spawns is that a lot of times, depending on how good the spawn maker is, those will be contaminated with bacteria and other fungi. And the person selling the ampule, if they're not really good at it, will sell you a contaminated sample. Augers are very similar. What happens is they'll inoculate it, and once that mycelium has run up the sides, and if that cap has been opened, if you notice that cap there doesn't have a vent or a what do they call it, a septum, what happens is you can actually have organisms go in as the cap expands and contracts, and you really can't really tell if your vial is clean or not. Grain spawn is a little different story. Most of the industry, especially the bispores, the button mushroom and this and that, like grain spawn, and you'll see grain spawn recommended especially for bag culture. The bad thing about grain spawn is that all of those grains, most of the time your colonization is on the outside of it, and it's supercharged with nutrient. So if that grain is damaged, you've now opened up a site for contamination. And if things aren't perfect, or on the thing, especially once you get out into, especially nature per se, or unless you have a room that has a HEPA filter or whatever onto it, your contamination rate goes up dramatically. When San Antonio and I used to visit the bispores growers, and they would be complaining about contamination. A lot of times we would go into the bed, and we would find those grains that were broken and this and that, completely contaminated with aspergillus and trichoderma and everything else, and it dramatically decreases your yield. A 5-pound bag of spawn, this is from Field and Forest, and this is sawdust spawn that's mixed with millet, gypsum, and then they sterilize it and they put a pure culture in it. It'll knock about 37 logs, 37 6-inch logs with no problem, which means basically your inoculation is costing you less than $1, which changes the game a lot, because with the spawn disc method, you can do it really quick. I have no idea how many logs you can inoculate with the drill method, drill and fill, but I will tell you that you'll run out of energy before you run out of the bag. Sometimes the bag will take us 2 days to go through. We never really counted how many. There are many other species that we grow, especially from people like Field and Forest. If you want to spread your fruiting time over, this first one here is olive, followed by summer white, and that's your blue dolphin, which is a winter one. So we can actually space our fruiting out pretty much all fall into most of winter, and then late fall into early spring. We can have fruit just about continuously. And on the same line, shiitake, we grow, we have a pretty good selection. We grow all the ones that Field and Forest sells, and they do fruit at different times. We go early fall, all the way through winter, into early spring, and just a little bit early summer. And then the fruiting will stop unless we force them. Again, once you open the bag, the game is on. You can store the bags in a refrigerator. Just what we do, well, anyway, just remember that contaminators are everywhere. After the bag has been opened, we rebag, the bag that we had in a new Ziploc bag, leaving the old bag on and refrigerate. Some people freeze them. We don't do that, but I know people that do it. They pull it out and it's fine. We've had bags 2 years old, sawdust spawn, that we will break it up and it'll immediately recolonize once it's in a little bit warmer temperature. They do not stop growing at 4 degrees. And that goes for almost all of them, except for some of the hot weather ones like the pink, and actually the cornucopia is a little cold sensitive also. Magic mushrooms. If you haven't been hit with it, you're going to. Make sure that you know your applicable federal and state laws. It can be very confusing. It is legal in certain places. District of Columbia, I think, Colorado, Oregon, They've been around for a long time. They're extremely easy to grow. When I was at USDA, we had people coming in all the time wanting to learn how to do it. The standard method for growing agaricus, if you look up San Antonio's method, it works like a cake. An interesting one was when I was there, the first application for a patent of a biological organism was a psilocybin mushroom that produced large sclerotia. We grew it there in a Forma box, and it was supposed to be for identification. And I was all excited. It was a Friday morning, and I got there at the crack of dawn. And when I went in, they had all been harvested. And then I was a little ticked off at the taxonomist and Dr. San Antonio. And then Dr. San Antonio came in and he said the same, they were gone. And he thought that the taxonomist had taken them. And then the taxonomist came and was really ticked off because he wanted to take pictures and everything. And then we realized that we'd gotten ripped off. And somebody had gifted them watching and took them all. Then ironically, we were about to set a second set up to do it. And the applicant who had applied for the patent was found murdered. He was found in Texas in a greenhouse operation that he had in a clean room, and with most of the doors locked in. We never found out if they found out who did it or whatever. Of course, there's a classic psilocybin there. There's one more issue here on the magic mushrooms. We do a lot of shows and some training things, and of course we have visitors and that, and we do the farmers markets. And we're getting a tremendous amount of people that want to buy or grow psilocybin mushrooms for their children because of all the work that's being done at Johns Hopkins and about 4 other locations around the United States. And they're actually having very good results. And so, but to get into those programs, those studies, it's extremely difficult because the one guy I spoke to that works at the Johns Hopkins in that group, he said that they get roughly 200 to 400 people wanting to be part of that study per week. And basically the only way that you can get into those studies is through a psychiatrist because they want you diagnosed and everything before. But a lot of parents find that if their children especially are having serious issues, which mental issues are, that they're willing to try anything, but they're also scared to death that they're going to do damage to their children. So it's a heck of a pickle. I go back to the top one, knowing the federal and state laws, and I usually tell them I have no desire to spend 5 years in jail over it. You can buy it online, but again, you're taking a chance. There are strains of psilocybin that are very mild, and then there are some that are off the charts. It's just like the problem we have with marijuana. It could be mild or it could be knock you back for a loop. If you haven't dealt with it, you're going to deal with it somewhere along the line if you're dealing with the public. Our Maryland's farm, we've been in production here over 25 years. Originally, we marketed strictly to wholesale, small grocery and stands, vegetable stands and this and that. We returned to farmers markets sales, one, because it gave us more of a market for our secondary product. And also it was very hard to predict our yields because one day we're picking 5 pounds, the next 50. But we did find out that in the farmers markets, we're typically sold out within a couple hours, which is a very bad business. And over the years, we keep increasing and increasing and increasing and still can't meet the demand. I do have to admit that we sell a little cheaper than most places do. We sell for $5 a pint, But that's mainly because we want this to be introduced into the regular mining expression, the regular homeowner, not the mining expression foodies. One of the biggest problems that we had was that we originally bet on shiitake mushroom, not oyster. And that's because when you look at the national statistics, for every 5 units of shiitake, we're supposed to sell 1 unit of oyster. Well, when we got into the farmers markets, and actually we saw this in the grocery stores and in the produce stands, we're selling 5 to 10 oyster mushroom units to every 1 shiitake. And the other part about it is that our growing oyster cycle is 3 to 6 months, so we can actually make more money on the oysters. But it's taken us, in fact, even right now, we are not caught up. We always sell out of oyster fast. Rarely do we ever take oyster home. And the sale of all the other mushrooms, we have, I'll show you pictures of it here in a minute: chestnut, piopini, lion's mane. I'm trying to remember, I can't see that one that's behind there. And we sell an amazing amount of reishi. This farm here in Maryland, which I'm there right now, it's closed now. We closed in 2023, and we're reopening at our Virginia farm in Matthews. So see, here's your king. This is your black pearl growing off of blocks. Here's chestnut. We buy all of our ready-to-fruit blocks from Field and Forest. We don't make them. They sell them to us cheap enough that it's not worth our resources to do it in our time. We try to produce as much as we can off the wood. It's a much, much higher profit margin. And, this helps supplement, brings in extra income, and stimulates more interest. But these things like the chestnut and the piopini, they are selling off the chart. Here's lion's mane. We grow a lot of lion's mane, and we sell a lot of lion's mane. We also grow the coral one. It doesn't sell quite as good, but when the lion's mane are producing, we can't keep it in. The yellow oyster, can't keep it in. It is very prolific. It has a little different flavor. I describe it as a phenolic flavor, and I personally don't like it, but everybody else loves it. You can see here also, if you look at some of those logs, that's when we tried using the foam plugs. And as far as I'm concerned, that's a no-no. The reason being is that you'll go to where you've inoculated logs and you'll see those plugs gone. And at first, I was talking with Joe about it, and I was sitting there watching the log, looking at the log, and he says, well, they kind of dry out and they'll fall out. And about that time, a bird comes along, pecks it, grabs it, takes it away. So I think that most of the time we saw that was from bird damage, and then it leaves the sawdust exposed. This one, for some people, should, since you all are foragers, you all know what this one is. This is hen of the woods. We grow it off of blocks, what you call like a spawn block. We also grow it off of logs, and we're getting better and better at it. We can't even come close to this demand. This is sold out 15, 20 seconds into the market. People see it, it's gone. The Matthews Market farm, we're located central to a bunch of markets, in the sense of large markets. Our target will be about 500,000 logs. We hope to be in that production era within about 5 to 10 years. Right now, we're working with the Department of Forestry for developing two parts. One is getting logs, and what we're preferentially looking for are small, 4 to 6 inch, 8 inch diameter logs of all types of deciduous trees. We've been working with the idea of, in fact, we've done this with Maryland, and now we're doing it with Virginia, of looking at like a soybean field, that instead of planting it in soybean, you can grow logs in it. And preferably what you would want to do is have a mixture of fast poplar gum all the way to oak and ironwood and things like this. And then you harvest harvest them out, the smaller, let's say the fast growers. What we immediately found was that when you do that, the trees, if you cut them correctly, will re-sprout so that you have a continuous supply of logs. And over the 10 or 15 years later, your oak logs will then be caught up, and you'll have the same thing. It's a long-term view. The Virginia Forestry is extremely interested in it, the same with Maryland. The problem is it's a research project, and I'm done with that. I told them that I would help in the data correlations and the writing of the papers and everything, but I'm not going to go out and do yield studies. We're also setting up, and this is already set up in Virginia, where you have a lot of people with 5-10 acres that have little woodlots, and the market for trees out here is gone. It doesn't really exist. So people can sell us logs, and we have foresters that will go in and harvest those logs. And we're just setting that up now, although the forestry department has a listing of all of the loggers, and it has a listing of all of these people with, small acreage, woodlot farms. And one of the other things we do with that is we also help in the educating people on how they can grow how they can grow mushrooms off the logs. We're also working with the Cooperative Extension Service in building a commercial kitchen for all of our secondary product, anything that you have left over. And what we're talking about are value-added products. Let's see, I guess I didn't finish them all. You have things like there's a tremendous market for dried mushrooms. We sell probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $20,000 to $30,000 worth of dried mushrooms a year in 1 ounce packs. We sell just about anything we have extra. The oyster and a lot of the other ones sell just as good as the shiitake. The other thing is jerky, soups. What we're hoping with the commercial kitchen is to have a freeze dryers installed so that we can freeze dry these products. And we have one chain right off the bat that wants 50,000 units. We know that we can sell through the farmers markets and everything, just about everything we can currently produce. And there's beef, there's the mushroom jerky, a few other products. Field and Forest is supposed to get us some listing of some other things. The other thing about Matthews and why we're down there is the abundance of wood. It is a swamp. We have an unbelievable amount of maples. And if you look at that first thing, you'll see that it's almost the perfect diameter. And they grow extremely fast, and their value as a wood source is basically worthless. So in the case here, we're in an area that the timber industry is struggling, although they have a tremendous amount. At the same time, we have gotten permission from the Corps of Engineers to grow in wetlands. So a lot of people that have tree lots or property in the wetlands can now do this. And there are some restrictions that we have to follow, but it's really very good. And it opens up a lot more land. The other thing is foggy here. Our logs, this place is crazy. Every day, in Virginia on the water there, the fog comes in every day and waters the logs. We've never gotten yield like this ever before. I'll bring logs from Maryland down there, that aren't fruiting, and usually within a week they're fruiting. So we know that we're going to be going through the logs faster, but I mean the quality of the material is excellent. Again, here's some of those commercial kitchen products. There's your soup. There's the jerky in the middle, and of course dried shiitake. Although we sell most of our dried shiitake cut in strips. It dries faster and it allows us to dry at a lower temperature, giving us a higher quality product with a better flavor. And theoretically, it should hold some of the medicinal values better. We can compete directly with Japanese and Chinese product. In fact, we can probably beat them as a nation. You know, in the United States, we have the wood. In fact, there's even one Japanese company that's thinking about opening up an operation down in this area in Virginia, the southern area. There are a couple other little things. Well, I guess I should probably stop. I've been going a long time.
We do have some questions, Pat. We do have some questions building up in the chat. And
okay.
I know people have more questions than what they put in the chat. This has been awesome. And I think kind of unbelievable for some people too.
It is a little crazy, and my wife will definitely tell you that it is crazy. You know, but we try to manage it.
She doesn't mind that it's lucrative, does she?
Huh?
She doesn't mind that part.
She's not interested in the money end. She's more interested in, we're really large into native plants, and she's an avid bird watcher. Her first thing in the morning is to pull the binoculars out and do a bird count. And, now we're building up our collection of bird houses, and where we live, you go out the back door and you're lucky if you don't get hit by a bird. We're right on the water, and we have eagles, we have it all right there. It's crazy. Yeah.
So I'm going to actually start with some of the questions in the chat just at the bottom because it's a little bit easier, which isn't completely fair. But Taylor Bennett is asking a good question. Does the type of log, because you've grown them on all different kinds of logs. We saw Patrick's farm, and we saw the beech trees and birch trees and gum trees and all different kinds of hardwoods. And so Taylor wants to know if the type of log influences the flavor of the mushroom that you're growing it on.
That's a great question. I personally can't tell any difference. I do have some people that say that they can tell, but again, you'd have to have a blind taste test for that. And again, we're not research. Although I'm sure if you took that up to another level, you know, like the University of Maryland, the Food and Nutrition group, they do those types of studies. But I can't tell any difference. Now, we might find a difference on the pine. Yeah.
Right, right. And then, let's see, I'm just going in here. Oh, it says on the can of patty straw mushrooms that they're peeled. Do you know, is that, they have a outer skin or something?
What it is, you can find the cans where they have the skin on them, and you can find it without the skin. And what we found was that we were talking to, Jim and I were talking to a guy that had a cannery, and he said Americans like the white mushroom. They don't like the dirty brown mushroom. So, you know, and the flavor is really different in the canned. It's night and day different.
Yes.
Yeah. Does that answer that question?
I think so. And yeah, that's the whole thing with the Agaricus bisporus, like the white strain. I remember when they developed that, then everybody wanted to grow that one instead of the browner strains, which some people don't know. The Portobello and the Cremini are all Agaricus bisporus.
Yeah.
And then someone was asking if you could review a little bit. Do you have any of the spawn discs there with you? I guess maybe you don't, because
I don't have them. I do have pictures of them, and I could probably send those to you. It'd probably take me a little while to find them. I could probably get it to you tomorrow or the next day, and then you could, for interested people. But basically, what you're doing is we buy the foil from BJ's Club, and it's their heavy duty foil. It comes in an 18-inch width. So that gives us the ability to do up to 18-inch diameter logs, although you can do larger logs by, putting the pieces together. But basically what we do is we crumble that, we bang up that bag of spawn, and then we reach in with our hands and crumble it in the circle. And then we take and put another piece of foil on top, crimp the edges, and it usually takes about a week to 2 weeks. That's right. Then we make a whole bunch of them. So we'll make, at a minimum, I'll do 72. And that way I'll have both ends covered for 36 logs. And I know that I can use about a bag of spawn there. So I'll make a whole 72 of them, and I'll put them into a black trash bag, or I'll put them in some type of plastic container. It doesn't matter. Usually wait about a week, week and a half. You'll peek in there, and it should be grown solid. You can generally keep those spawn discs around for almost a month before you have to use them. One of the other big advantages of that spawn disc method is by breaking them out of that bag, you'll find out if your spawn is contaminated. I cannot tell you how many, because we don't just buy from Field and Forest. We buy spawn from other companies, and I'll get bags of spawn, crack them open, start using it, open it up later on, and it's full of green mold or aspergillus, flatus usually. So we get a little bit of everything, and it's almost consistent to the bag and consistent to the company. And then usually I contact them and I talk to them about it. To be honest with you, I'm not concerned about the money end of it, as I'm concerned about the not having a good spawn, and that they're selling that spawn to someone else who's having problems. And then the classic answer is, when you call the spawn companies, they say, "Oh, you must have done something wrong." Well, no, every once in a while, spawn companies make mistakes. In fact, you have to give them a little bit of an edge there, that it's a really tough process. And there are a lot of places to go wrong, and even the best companies mess up. When I used to make spawn at USDA, our arch enemy was the cheese mite. And it's a little tiny spider that's all over your body. So you're making spawn, and they're crawling off of you onto your surface that you're working. Then they'll crawl inside of the Petri dish plate, and they'll crawl right along. And as they crawl along, they leave bacteria on there. So at USDA, what we used to do is we would put out target plates that were basically just like a PDA auger, and just leave them out in the work area, in the hood, the clean area. And sooner or later, you look on that plate and you could see where they've been crawling. And then if you look at a microscope, you'd actually see them clumping their way across the auger plate. They'll eat the auger and everything. And I've found that in a lot of spawn bags that I've gotten over the years. I have a microscope here, and I'll pull the microscope out. usually what I do is if there's any issue, I'll check the bag for leaks. And then after that, I'll look at the spawn, and it's not unusual for me to, when I don't get a good spawn disc, I'll go in there and find cheese mites. It's very common.
Huh. So this was something you and I talked about earlier today, about whether you can inoculate at a different time of year. And then somebody asked a related question, whether you should supplement with additional sugars. And I know from talking to you what your answer is going to be, but
the whole sugar thing is the wrong direction. It was one thing if you're growing in the sense of fruiting bags and things like that, you can do enhancement, but you have to be careful that you don't cross the line where you have free sugar. If you have free sugar, and if you're doing outdoor culture or in a room culture, your whole room is full of spores from everything. And you have that free sugar, it's going to go in there, and it's going to compete. And in many cases, depending on your temperature, you've created a different niche. When you have free water with free sugar, everything grows on. In fact, when we have people that grow, they like to grow in containers and things like this, and they always say, well, how do you, what's your, what humidity do you want to grow at? And if you seal your container, you're typically running up to 100%, and you'll see moisture on the sides, which will almost immediately attract Aspergillus, penicillin, and everything else in there. So now you super contaminated it, and you'll even contaminate your block. So you don't want to see free water unless it's the water that you're using for your humidity. And even then you should change that out every once in a while. In fact, some people chlorinate that at a mild level to try to inhibit that growth. That's a whole area study we've never really done. We do like those containers. They work great. Although commercially, we don't do it. We just literally have them on racks outside, and they fruit like they're going out of style. What was the other part of that question? That was, about inoculating logs year round. We have done it, and it does work, but and just recently we did another set of rounds doing oyster and shiitake. And this last round, and we basically did through the entire summer. And what we found was that we are getting good inoculation, but we don't know about yield yet.
Right.
And our biggest concern is safety. I mean, I've already broken my leg. My wife says if it happens again, I'm already not allowed on the roof. Pretty soon it'll be I'm not allowed on the pickup truck. Then she'll say I can't use a chainsaw. I can't do this, can't do that because I get hurt. So I'm ultra conservative on trying to make sure I don't get hurt, because she said she also won't take care of me if I get hurt again.
Okay.
Gosh, I hope she doesn't hear that, because she did say that, but I'm not supposed to repeat it, I'm sure. The other big thing, I left this out on the spawn disc method, is that now when you cut that tree, all of the top branches, which you normally couldn't use, you can inoculate, and that works, and it works great. We've inoculated branches an inch in diameter, and just let it grow all the way up through the rest of the branch, the twigs and everything, and they fruit. So it works. Cool. In fact, it's got a really high sugar rate in those branches. So it does it, which is really nice, because now we're increasing what we can get out of a tree, probably 20, 30%.
That's amazing.
And it works great. and I've really known this all along, although it didn't come to fruit till just recently. We used to sell a little log 4 inches long, about an inch diameter, that we would have knocked out with a spawn disc method. And we sold probably 20,000 of them, something like that. By the way, if somebody wants to make money, that's a good one. That's a good one. You grow little oyster logs and you'll sell them faster than you can collect the money.
So you said 4 inches and an inch in diameter?
Yeah. Yeah.
How much were you charging for that? Just out of, do you mind sharing
$2.
how much you're? Wow, that's a lot of wood.
Well, no, that's not very much wood. It's very small.
No, I mean, well, just with the tree branching out, it's got a lot of those little.
Oh no, we didn't. Well, we sold the little logs that were they were only 4 inches long. They'd fit in a bag, and then we would put a label on the top, and all the people had to do was put water in the bag, and they would fruit. They were oyster logs.
That's brilliant.
And in fact, whatever you do, do not advertise in organic gardening. I don't know if it's still published, but
it is.
Oh, it is. Oh gosh, if you do it in the ads, you'll get literally duffel bags full of people buying them, and you'll run out. And then when you try to stop the advertisement, they'll never stop, because anything that gets a response, they like it. We did it, and 2 days after it came out, we called them to stop it. You know, don't redo it. And 3 months, it kept coming. And we kept calling, but they wouldn't stop it. So that's a nice little product, especially for, we make those for when we do tours with kids. You know, we'll have 10 or 15 kids, and so that they have something to take home, we'll actually let them make a little spawn disc miniature log, whatever we have laying around, you know, type of deal. They put it in the bag, and then they have to show patience. But, and usually what happens is, you know, the kids forget about it till one day they see it on their shelf and it's fruiting, and then they, you know, then they get all excited. And it's something we could give away with very little cost, and we try to do that as much as possible. That's the other thing we're also doing with the Cooperative Extension, is we're setting up a training center. We have 2 buildings, one holds 20 and one holds 40. And it'll be for introducing mushroom cultivation to homeowners, and then also commercial. And then we're hoping to be able to have people like the field and forest people, the medicinal people, come in and give lectures and stuff like that. We have a place that's called the Croquet Club, and they're willing to rent us those facilities, and it saves us. It has bathrooms and has parking, which is a big deal. I mean, even here at the farm here, you know, we get 10, 15 cars, and you know, people get stuck, and you know, it's hard to invest money in stuff like that. And I'm not going to let them use the house bathroom. So
good idea.
Yeah. It's
been so much fun. This is great. It's just so much fun to hear everything you've figured out for the length of time you've been doing this, and then all the different innovative ways you've figured out to market and reach out to people. And I just so appreciate you being so generous, sharing all this knowledge, because it's just amazing. Really.
Well, this is the whole process of normalization. In the sense, we go to a couple markets where we're not the only vendor. And at first, the other vendors would usually say, oh no, you're going to hurt our market. You know, you're going to take away our business. But what generally has been found is that their business will almost double when we're there. And we'll do very well, because when people see 2 vendors with mushrooms, they think this is normal. And so you know, it's just like when you go to Europe and you go into a grocery store, and in the vegetable section, 1/3 of the produce is mushrooms. You go to, you know, Asia, and it's close to half with all these different mushrooms. That's why people are buying some more. As a matter of fact, when you look at the predicted market for mushrooms, fresh mushrooms, you see that I haven't seen any yet that have said less than a 10% gain every year. But the thing about it is, in the United States, it's probably 30 to 40% gain. And the reason being is that we've never had these different mushrooms available to us. And now we're getting more growers, so they're becoming available. And as long as we can keep the price reasonable, because we're not a subsidized crop like beef and chicken.
True.
Yeah, so there has been talk of subsidizing, the mushroom industry.
Wow.
Actually, the button mushroom industry has been subsidized. The more of the exotics and this and that have not been, although I don't think we really need it. I just think we need to build up production, like the spawn disc method now. Again, people, I tell them 500,000 logs, and they look at me like I'm nuts, and they say, how many people do you have? And I say, well, sometimes there's 2 of us, and then I'll hire interns, and we pay them well. We have a long list of people that want to be interns to learn how to do it, and a bunch of them have started out on their own. And then, of course, we're helping other small farms get started in this. I think we're up to about 40 now, somewhere around there. Just people getting started. And I don't know how many homeowners, but it's a lot. And, and it multiplies pretty quick. So, and we'll help them any way we can. It's in our interest,
Yeah. Well, I know we usually end at 9. We're 10 minutes past. And
Sweetheart,
yes.
Milton had another question.
Okay. Milton, you want to ask your question? You can unmute.
Well, he wrote it down. If you want to, can you read?
Okay. About rehydrating dried logs and inoculating with the disc method. And yeah, so it's a question about whether you can rehydrate dried out logs and then inoculate with the spawn disc method.
What I can tell you for sure is that we've had logs that I would say that were 1 and 2 years old. And when people, we did some preliminary work on this. And what we did was we drilled all the way into the hardwood. In the case of, we're talking logs 12, 18 inches diameter. And then we would push the oyster spawn in there, and it colonized. Of course, you've lost all that other wood on there. And we've gotten fruit off of it. Commercially, it's definitely not worthwhile doing. Your labor is too much, which so you can't warrant putting that much labor into it.
So have you actually tried using spawn disc method on old logs that have been rehydrated? And I mean, you probably haven't needed to, so.
No,
I guess it'd be a simple enough experiment.
Right, yeah. It's probably worthwhile a thing to do, but I've got about 100 things in front of that one. One of the other things I didn't mention about for homeowners is that just because, we use the spawn disc method, this and that, that's for cut up logs. But one of the first shiitake growers that I met in the US was a Dr. Wu. He was in Montgomery County. And what he did, he just cut the trees down, left them in entirety, didn't cut them up or anything, and just plugged them. And that works fine. He actually had, he had a pick your own vegetable farm, and he didn't have to pay to pick them. And all of his customers would pick their own. So they just go walk out there and do it. Now, it spreads it out so it's a lot more work to pick, but that works fine. So a lot of people in their, if you have a small house, whatever, tree falls down, you can inoculate it, in its entirety. You can go back later on, chop it up if you want, but that works great. The Knerf method of inoculating, that's where you make the slits and then stuff it. That works great for that. So you don't have to drill it all, and that's really fast. I should have gone through that method, but there were only so many hours in the day since I started this thing. In fact, this was a nice way to start on this thing, and I would appreciate comments back from the people that are here with it, in the sense of what is the most important, what did I leave out, things that could have been clearer, and I would really appreciate that feedback, because again, it's all a work in progress, and so I mean, I'll use this later on for other talks, and I'll be refining it. I know a whole bunch of areas I want to work on, so yeah.
This was awesome the way you have it. I'm happy to give feedback too, but and we also had a lot of discussion in the chat, so you'll want to actually, for people that don't know, at the end of the chat there's like 3 dots that you click on, and it will give you an option to copy the chat so that you can keep it, because I had put your 2 articles in there, links to your 2 articles in there that are open source articles. Thank you for making them open source. So people who are still here may want to go ahead and copy the chat there so that they have that resource.
Would I be able to get a copy of the chats later sometime?
Yes, and you could do it right now yourself if you get in the chat, but I'll send it to you as well.
Okay, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah.
I'm really looking for the input back. Again, we just refine it and we'll make it better. And I think this is the first Zoom that I've ever done on this topic.
You did great.
It was a short. You just can't imagine how busy it is for me right now. But like I said, my wife was all over my case. But it's important. If I don't get started, I won't do it. And especially my mind doesn't get better. So
yeah, I'm going to encourage people to type their appreciations in the chat so that I can add that on. Yes, so Patrick's in the process of moving from Maryland to Virginia and trying to sell this house that he's sitting in right now, and has a huge list of things he's doing, plus inoculating all these things and all this other stuff he's setting up. So I'm just curious, did the Forestry Commission, did they come to you or did you go to them?
I went to them.
Okay.
In both Maryland and Virginia. It's amazing that when you talk to them, it's like a whole new world. They're so locked into the dollar value of lumber and this and that, that they don't really see this as an industry. And to be honest with you, it's not. I mean, in the sense of large, dollar, as not much dollar as timber is. And I knew that this was the log supply was going to be the issue, because in Western Maryland, it was over 20 years ago, they formed a large co-op for shiitake. And they were doing very good. And then all of a sudden, boom, it stopped. And what it was, they ran out of wood. They had cut all their own, and then they didn't want to buy it in because it was coming out of their pocket. And
so they weren't coppicing, like they weren't, figuring that out, I guess.
Oh, no. Most farmers don't work that way. It's like, oh, I can cut this tree down and get $40 for it. They don't think that runs out. And if they had a lot of acreage, you think that you would not run out. The largest operation I've seen was a Korean operation in the Appalachians. And I'm sure they were 500,000 logs. It was unbelievably crazy because they were using large equipment, making ruts 4 or 5 feet deep, and they were inoculating, 4-foot diameter oaks and everything else like that. And everything they produced was being sold back to Korea dried. When we asked them about doing it fresh, they just kind of laughed at us like, why should we? We make more money by selling it dried, which is true. Yeah, I think you do, when you start to look at all the economics of it. But, it doesn't take long to run that distance. But if you look at it in a long-term view of having a replenishable crop, especially when we're talking about areas like that are growing soybean and field corn, where where you're in water sensitive areas and things like this. And then of course you got the whole pesticide and herbicide issues. The forestry department, they love this because they're losing land for both for people living in there, and also these out in northern neck Virginia. I drove by a place and they had clear cut 150, 200 acres, and throughout that entire area there must have been probably 500,000 trees that were just laying on the ground that are going to rot, that could have been used for this, and somebody could have made some money out of it.
Right.
But we're not there. Will we be there later? I think so, especially since I've seen some of the responses from Joe's with the forestry thing.
Right.
Getting the logs is a big deal, and if you can get them cut to the right size, and that now you can get into production. The market is there, and the only problem is the more interest in these cultivated mushrooms, the more interest there's going to be of wild picking, and you're going to have more competition out there in the field.
I think that's already happening.
It is already happening big time. In Maryland, there's already parks that one say no, others make you get a permit, and the other ones have limiting. Same thing with commercial people. When I was in California, I met a guy. He almost got into a fist fight over a golden chanterelle patch. And then he calmed down when he realized that we were only going to take maybe, a quart like that. Well, he picked them all. He didn't leave any for anybody, But he was making his living doing that. So, it's pretty hard to knock him. And just like fishing, you fish all the fish, then hey, you did it to yourself. And that's actually where the cultivation comes in, because the demand, if we could increase growers by a factor of 10, we would still not meet 10%, 15% of the market. That's it. I mean, all the grocery stores want to carry these mushrooms. Their problem is they can't find the suppliers. Right. Because they want those customers that want to buy that product. And I get calls all the time from grocery stores, and we just can't do it. Trader Joe's, if they want, the guy says, I just want 1 case per store. Well, how many stores do they have? 400. That's $250,000. No, they can't do that. And I've heard that from other growers on the same story. What we really have to do is take care of our secondary product, our value-added product, and tighten that up, and then that'll give us more money to invest into more logs and stuff like that. But mainly have more growers and have homeowners do it.
Right.
Because that increases the demand even more. So
great. Well, I'm being prodded by my husband to stop the.
Yeah.
But I know I could keep going, but I think
I'm sorry to go so long.
No, don't apologize at all. This has been wonderful. People are thrilled. So yeah, really great, really, really great.
And I'll try to refine this later. And there's some topics I missed that I'd like to go through that are kind of important things I left over. And maybe that'll be on version 2. you
Right.
know. Yeah. All right,
Okay.
then. I guess
Thank
does that leave us? We're good?
Yes, thank you again so much.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you all for putting up with me. And, I'm sure if you're like the Washington Mycological Society, the interest is going up and up and up. And, people are very interested in it. And, that's the way it goes.
And thank
Okay.
your wife for allowing you to do this too.
Yeah, I'm sure I'm going to get some grief, but I put up with some of her stuff too. So,
All right.
She's very patient with me. When I worry is when she gets quiet. Been married long enough to know that. Alrighty, I'm going to go ahead and leave.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
All right. Nice talking to y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank all the current and new members who have joined, and spread the news. And we'll have this on our YouTube channel probably in the next, I would say, 2 or 3 weeks, depending on how busy Lauren is. All right. Thank you all.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Cornelia.